At Jefferson High School, nestled between cracked sidewalks and aging buildings in a district long forgotten by policymakers, the atmosphere inside its brick walls carried a silent kind of weight, a heaviness passed down from generations of unspoken tension, quiet prejudice, and the kind of institutional neglect that wore on both spirit and stone. The classrooms smelled faintly of old chalk, the linoleum floors yellowed with time, and the heating system moaned like it remembered when students were still allowed to dream big. Inside room 204, the air was no different, stale, slow, oppressive, but among the 40 or so chipped desks and flickering fluorescent lights, there was one desk that held something rare, something determined and quietly powerful. Zahara James. At just 14, Zahara possessed a brilliance that even she wasn't entirely aware of yet, a clarity of thought and depth of curiosity far beyond her years, honed not through privilege but persistence, shaped in the silence of late-night study sessions and weekend library visits when others scrolled through distractions on phones she couldn't afford. Her backpack was worn but clean. Her notebooks were meticulously organized, with color-coded tabs, highlighted notes, and summaries she wrote herself, not because anyone told her to, but because she craved understanding. She was the kind of student teachers claimed they wanted in theory, but not always in practice, especially not when the student came wrapped in dark skin, cornrows, and quiet confidence. Zahara's eyes sparkled with ideas, but in Mrs. Eleanor Whitman's English class, those ideas were often ignored, twisted, or dismissed altogether. Mrs. Whitman, a 62-year-old woman with silver-streaked hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and a tone sharper than broken glass, had taught for more than 3 decades, priding herself on tough love and classroom control, though many students called it something else entirely. She had tenure, a reputation for rigor, and a subtle but potent disdain for change. Her room was filled with posters of Hemingway, Steinbeck, and Faulkner, voices that echoed whiteness, and she rarely welcomed anything newer than 1980. She referred to herself as a relic, but what she really was, beneath the high-minded, literary jargon, was a gatekeeper, someone who measured intelligence not by depth of thought, but by conformity to her narrow expectations of who could be brilliant and how that brilliance should look, sound, and act. Zahara didn't fit that mold, and it showed in every interaction between them. Whenever Zahara raised her hand, often with carefully articulated questions or answers that reflected hours of thought, Mrs. Whitman would purse her lips as if holding back a yawn, glance around the room as if looking for someone else to call on, and eventually respond with a cold "anyone else?" as if Zahara's insight was a bother, not a contribution. On the rare occasions when Zahara's voice could not be ignored, when her analysis pierced through the room with undeniable clarity, Mrs. Whitman would respond with comments like, "Well, that was surprising," or "I assume someone helped you with that." She never said outright that Zahara didn't belong, but her tone said it for her. Other students noticed, of course. They watched how Mrs. Whitman's demeanor softened for students, like Emily and Carson, how she praised their mediocre thoughts as promising, while Zahara's brilliance was met with suspicion. The class had become a quiet chorus of complicity, not because the students agreed, but because they feared rocking the boat, feared that stepping forward would make them a target too. So they sat in silence, while Zahara endured the subtle slights, the raised eyebrows, the sarcasm dipped in venom, and the slow erosion of self-worth that came from being told, day after day, that your best would never be good enough. The tipping point came on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, a day where grey clouds lingered over the school like a warning. The class was discussing American literature, and Zahara, confident in her understanding, referenced a line from Beloved by Toni Morrison, weaving it into a larger point about memory and generational trauma. The moment was elegant, seamless, a moment that should have sparked discussion, admiration, growth. But instead, Mrs. Whitman froze, narrowed her eyes, and said, loud enough for every student to hear, "Maybe stick to something simpler next. Time, Zahara. That kind of literature might be a little out of your league." The words dropped like a grenade in the room. A few students gasped softly. A few exchanged awkward glances, but most just stared, paralyzed by the open, unfiltered cruelty of it. Zahara felt her heart drop. Her face flushed, not from shame, she knew her point had been valid, but from the humiliation of being publicly belittled by someone who was supposed to nurture her. She blinked quickly, fighting the sting in her eyes, and stared down at her notebook, pretending to write something, anything, just to disappear. Mrs. Whitman continued the lecture as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had shifted. In the back row, Liam Carter, a quiet sophomore with a mop of unkempt blonde hair, and the kind of observant gaze that made teachers underestimate him, had watched it all unfold. Liam was the type of student who rarely spoke unless called upon, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he had learned that silence was a kind of safety. But he had also learned, thanks to his older sister, a college student who majored in social justice, that silence was sometimes betrayal. He had always admired Zahara from a distance, not in a romantic sense, but in awe. Her intelligence, her poise, the way she always seemed to have her thoughts in order. She had helped him with homework once, after school, without asking for anything in return, and he had never forgotten that kindness. Seeing her humiliated so viciously, so unfairly, lit something in him, a mix of anger, shame, and a dawning realization that he had been a bystander for too long. The seed of resistance was planted in that exact moment, not in a blaze of righteous fury, but in a quiet decision that something had to change. As the class ended, Zahara packed her things silently, her movements slow, almost mechanical. Liam watched her, a pit forming in his stomach. Around them, students laughed, chatted, and moved on as if the moment had already been erased, like so many others before it. But Liam couldn't shake it. As he walked to his next class, he kept thinking, if Mrs. Whitman could treat Zahara like that in front of everyone with no fear of consequence, how many others had she done it to? How long had this gone unchecked? And more importantly, what could he do about it? He didn't have answers yet, but he had resolve. And sometimes, resolve is the first step toward revolution. What none of them knew, not Zahara, not Liam, not even Mrs. Whitman, was that this moment, this spark of cruelty met with the quiet decision to no longer look away, would be the beginning of something that would change not only their classroom, but the entire school and perhaps even themselves. For in the shadow of injustice, sometimes all it takes is one person, one voice, one stand to turn silence into a storm. Liam Carter didn't sleep well that night. His mind raced with images of Zahara's downcast eyes and Mrs. Whitman's condescending tone echoing like a toxic mantra through the silence of his room, bouncing off posters of superheroes and shelves of half-read novels, each reflection reminding him that courage wasn't capes or costumes. It was conviction, and his was beginning to awaken. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the realization that staying quiet had made him part of the problem, and by morning that seed of discomfort had grown into something undeniable, a quiet fire in his chest that refused to dim. At school, the next day, Zahara walked with a composed expression, as if the previous day's insult hadn't sunk its claws into her, but Liam could see the fatigue behind her eyes, the way she paused for just a moment before entering room 204 again, like a soldier stepping into hostile ground. He slid into his seat and glanced at her, wondering how long she had been enduring this, and how many others had watched in silence. As Mrs. Whitman launched into another dry, monochrome lecture, Liam's heart pounded, not from fear of the teacher, but from the weight of what he was about to do. When the opportunity arrived, he raised his hand, something he rarely did, and when she called on him with a bored, "Yes, Liam," he asked, "Why don't we ever read any authors of color in this class?" The room fell into a thick silence, the kind that screams. Mrs. Whitman blinked, caught off guard, and after a beat replied curtly, "Because the curriculum focuses on the American canon, which has been historically defined by certain standards." Liam didn't back down. But isn't it part of education to challenge those standards, to include more voices? Zahara brought up Toni Morrison yesterday, and that's some of the best analysis I've heard in this class. Why was it dismissed? Zahara's eyes shot up in surprise, and the room collectively inhaled. Mrs. Whitman's expression soured. "That's enough, Liam. If you want to discuss reading lists, you may schedule time after school. We're not derailing today's lesson." But the derailment had already begun. Several students, emboldened by Liam's question, began murmuring, their eyes wide not with fear but with recognition that something real had just happened. Zahara looked at Liam with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, her lips parted slightly, as if searching for words she had forgotten how to say. After class, Mrs. Whitman pulled Liam aside, her tone venomously polite. "That was highly inappropriate," she hissed. "You undermined my authority in front of the class." Liam stared back, voice steady. "I think what's inappropriate is how you treat certain students. Everyone sees it, we're just not supposed to say anything." He walked away before she could respond, adrenaline coursing through him, heart pounding, but so lighter than it had been in days. Word of what had happened spread quickly. By lunch, students across grades were talking about it. Some were skeptical, others intrigued, but for the first time there was a conversation, and Zahara, still guarded but no longer invisible, was at the center of it. That evening, Liam started a group chat called Voices of 204, inviting classmates who he thought would understand. He asked them to share experiences, things they'd seen, moments of bias, silence that had stung. The chat exploded. Stories poured in. A Latina student recalled being told her accent would hold her back in public speaking. An Asian student recounted how his writing was called technically good but lacking soul. Black students described a pattern of being doubted, ignored, or held to double standards. The common thread was clear. Room 204 was a microcosm of a much bigger issue. Encouraged by the solidarity, Liam proposed something bold. They would draft a formal letter to the principal, outlining their concerns, citing specific incidents, and requesting curriculum reform and an investigation into Mrs. Whitman's behavior. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation, but Zahara, who had watched quietly as the chat unfolded, finally spoke. "I've been fighting this alone for years. If we don't say something now, it'll keep happening to the next Zahara. And the next." That sealed it. The letter was written collaboratively, line by line, with input from dozens of students. It was respectful but firm, intelligent and impassioned, a reflection of everything Mrs. Whitman had failed to see in them. They submitted it anonymously, signed as the students of Jefferson High, and within days a ripple turned into a wave. The principal, Mr. Harland, a man with a stiff demeanor and a deep fear of controversy, could not ignore the letter once the local school board caught wind of it. He announced a formal review of Room 204's classroom environment and teaching practices. Mrs. Whitman was placed on temporary administrative leave pending the investigation, a decision that sent shockwaves through the faculty lounge and hallways. "Alike," students whispered. Some teachers avoided eye contact with Zahara, others quietly expressed support. But the tide was turning. While Mrs. Whitman stewed in silence at home, students flourished in her absence. A substitute teacher, Ms. Kwan, young and eager, brought new life into the classroom. She assigned readings from Langston Hughes, Audre Lorde, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Discussions blossomed. Students spoke freely. Zahara shone like never. Before, her voice no longer stifled, her intellect finally allowed to take up space. And Liam, once a silent observer, became a leader, not of rebellion but of restoration. He organized reading circles after school, where students of all backgrounds gathered to explore diverse authors and share reflections. The media caught wind of the story when a local journalist interviewed Zahara and Liam under pseudonyms for an article on racial bias in education. The piece went viral. Alumni reached out. Teachers in other districts shared their own stories. What started as a quiet act of defiance became a movement. Parents began attending school board meetings, demanding more inclusive training for teachers and transparency in curriculum decisions. Jefferson High, once known for dusty traditions, was suddenly at the heart of a larger reckoning. Through it all, Zahara and Liam grew closer, not in romance but in mission. They understood each other in a way few others could. One had known injustice intimately, the other had seen it and refused to look away. Together they symbolized what education could be, not just a transfer of knowledge but a crucible for truth, courage, and change. Mrs. Whitman, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure. When she was interviewed by the District Review Board, her defensive responses and outdated justifications only worsened her case. She insisted she had treated all students equally and that the complaints were overblown, but her record, combined with testimonies from students past and present, painted a damning picture. Eventually, she was given the option to retire early or face formal disciplinary action. She chose retirement, releasing a vague public statement about the changing tides of education and her desire to step aside with dignity. Few mourned her departure, but the students of Room 204 did not celebrate with cruelty. They celebrated with creation. They hosted a student-led symposium on equity in education, inviting speakers, poets, and activists to share stories and tools for resistance. Zahara gave the opening speech. Liam gave the closing. What began as a whisper, one girl's silenced voice and one boy's decision to speak, had become a roar heard across campuses and communities. And though the road ahead was long, they had already changed the What happened next reverberated beyond the brick walls of Jefferson High, further than the pine-lined streets of its suburban neighborhood, and deeper than the halls of Room 204 could ever contain, because on that Friday morning, when the sun rose over the school's parking lot and 237 students, all dressed in black, stood shoulder to shoulder in absolute silence, holding handmade signs that read, "We stand with Zahara, her voice matters, and education shouldn't be conditional on race." A moment of truth was born, a spark of something both heavy and holy, as if every injustice ever ignored was finally finding voice through trembling hands and unflinching eyes, and as local news crews began setting up their cameras, and parents, who had once dismissed student grievances, started showing up to see the protest firsthand. What had started as an afterthought, a single teacher's sarcastic dismissal, had become a national flashpoint in the conversation about race, education, and accountability in American schools. Inside the school, Principal Harlan stood at his office window with a look of panic disguised as professionalism. Clutching the letter of formal complaint signed anonymously by dozens of students and printed out neatly in the folder Liam had handed him the day before, a folder not just of protest but of proof, documented remarks, dated testimonies, screenshots of group chats, essays Zahara had submitted that were marked down for vague reasons but held side by side with other students, papers bearing near-identical content and higher grades, and even anonymous letters from faculty members quietly affirming concerns they'd never had the courage to voice aloud. And while Harlan skimmed through the damning compilation, his assistant knocked gently to inform him that Zahara's parents had returned, this time not just with an attorney, but with a representative from the local NAACP chapter and a community organizer who had helped lead educational equity initiatives in the region for over a decade. And when Harlan stepped into the conference room where they waited, he was met not with anger, but with controlled fire. A poised attorney laying out state education codes, a mother tired of asking for respect, and a father who had fought too long for too little to let this be the story his daughter remembered from her youth. Meanwhile, inside Room 204, the substitute, Ms. Kwan, had paused class to acknowledge the protest outside, inviting students to reflect on what it meant to stand up for one another. And as they discussed what it truly meant to be seen, Zahara sat in the back, her hand tentatively raised, her voice finally invited and her words finally welcomed as she said, "Sometimes people think being smart is about having the right answer, but sometimes being smart is knowing when to question the answer they've always been given." And the class grew still, not out of discomfort, but out of respect, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows something honest has just been spoken. And one by one students nodded, and one even said softly, "That was deep," setting off a ripple of connection that had never existed before under Mrs. Whitman's reign. As the week continued, media attention only intensified, with local anchors interviewing students in front of the school gates and alumni posting open letters on social media, recalling their own memories of Ms. Whitman's bias and blind spots, while the school district, now caught in a tidal wave of scrutiny, issued a public statement promising a thorough and impartial investigation, though few trusted those words until they saw actions to match. Actions which came when a committee of external reviewers was formed, including cultural competency educators, legal experts, and even 2 students chosen to represent the school, body, Liam and Zahara. The announcement of their selection was met with applause in some circles and resentment in others, especially among staff who feared what their own classrooms might reveal under a similar microscope. But the truth was, a tide had turned and it would not reverse. In committee meetings, Zahara initially remained quiet, unsure if her voice truly belonged in a room full of professionals and polished presentations. But it was Liam who nudged her forward, reminding her, "You're the reason we're here. Speak." Like it. And when she did, something unlocked in the room, because her first-hand accounts, spoken with clarity, not rage, pierced through bureaucratic jargon, and one reviewer was even seen blinking away tears as Zahara recounted the subtle humiliations she'd endured, how her hand would be ignored, how her grammar would be over-scrutinized, how her ideas were often repackaged and praised only when restated by white students, and how she had started to doubt her own brilliance because of one woman's relentless erosion of her worth. Outside these meetings, students were engaging in their own revolution, organizing lunch forums, starting petitions to include more diverse authors in the curriculum, creating murals celebrating historical black figures on school property with reluctant but eventual district approval, and even launching a podcast titled 204 No More, where they shared stories of injustice, resistance, and empowerment, with Zahara and Liam as frequent co-hosts, though both often featured other students more than themselves, believing that amplification was a greater gift than attention. The podcast gained thousands of followers, some from neighboring schools who began hosting their own episodes under the banner of Student Voices Uncensored. And soon, a network of youth-driven dialogue formed across the county, prompting change in ways the district had never imagined. At home, Zahara's parents watched all of this unfold with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing full well the costs that often accompany leadership, especially for young black girls who speak truth in white-dominated institutions. But their support never wavered, and when Zahara broke down one night under the weight of so much expectation, her mother simply held her and said, "You were never meant to carry it alone, baby, but you were born to speak." And her father added, "And we're right behind you step for step," reminding her that this journey, though exhausting, was not hers to walk in isolation. Liam too faced pushback, angry whispers in hallways, former friends who accused him of stirring trouble, and even a teacher who marked down his participation grade with a cryptic note that read, "Focus on the material, not the politics." But he took it in stride, grounded by purpose and supported by new friendships forged in fire. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitman remained suspended, her silence both strategic and telling, refusing interviews, releasing no statements, her absence becoming its own form of commentary, though a leaked internal email revealed she had hired legal counsel and intended to sue for wrongful suspension, a move that only further galvanized public opinion against her, especially after it emerged that several of her former students, now adults, had submitted affidavits describing the exact same behavior Zahara and others had endured, their testimony spanning over a decade of quiet discrimination thinly veiled as discipline. And when the investigation concluded 3 weeks later, the findings were devastatingly clear. A pattern of racial bias, confirmed by grading inconsistencies, documented reports, corroborating witness accounts, and an overall failure to foster an inclusive learning environment, resulting in an official recommendation that Mrs. Whitman be terminated and that Jefferson High implement mandatory anti-bias training for all faculty, diversify its curriculum, and establish a student equity board to advise ongoing reforms. The announcement came during a special school assembly attended by parents, press, and even school board officials. And when Principal Harland, his voice steadier than before, perhaps changed by the process himself, read the findings aloud, a wave of emotion moved through the auditorium, culminating in a standing ovation as Zahara and Liam were acknowledged by name for their unwavering commitment to justice, truth, and educational excellence. And though Zahara blushed and looked down at her shoes, she didn't shrink. She stood tall, hand in hand with Liam, the two of them symbols of what happens when courage refuses to be silenced. After the assembly, students flooded the halls with energy, Teachers hugged their students with more awareness, and even skeptical parents began writing thank you emails to Zahara's family, recognizing that this movement had not just exposed a problem, but awakened a community to its own potential. And though the battle was far from over, and more challenges would come in many forms, subtle resistance, delayed reforms, bureaucratic friction, the foundation had been laid, not with hatred, but with hope. And the echoes of that Friday morning, when students stood in black beneath the rising sun, would live on not just in yearbooks or archived news clips, but in the memory of every student who had once been afraid to raise their hand, and now knew that someone would stand with them, if they did. 3 months had passed since the echo of protest chants and television cameras had faded from the steps of Jefferson High, yet what remained was not silence, but the resonant hum of change in motion, tangible, enduring, and steady as breath, as if the very bricks of the school had begun to hold a new truth between their mortar, that justice was no longer a theory to be debated, but a legacy to be lived. And when Mrs. Whitman was officially dismissed from her teaching position following the district's unanimous decision to terminate her contract with Cause, the act sent shockwaves not only through the faculty but across the state, for her case had become a lightning rod for discussions on systemic bias in education, and her termination became the subject of editorials, panel debates, and even university seminars analyzing how normalized microaggressions could destroy student confidence. Especially for black youth, the school board, after much deliberation and under increasing pressure from local and national voices, issued a formal public apology to Zahara during a televised district meeting, an event where cameras once again rolled as the board president, a man known more for polished neutrality than impassioned speech, looked directly into the lens and said, "We failed you, Zahara. And in doing so, we failed the principles we claim to uphold. But today we begin to make that right." And as applause broke out among the crowd, Zahara, who sat flanked by her parents and Liam, held her composure, though her fingers trembled slightly in her lap, not from fear, but from the weight of history folding into that single moment of acknowledgement. The apology was followed by sweeping reforms, mandatory anti-bias training for all school staff, student listening circles facilitated by equity coaches, and the launch of a new mentorship initiative led by educators of color, something Zahara had personally advocated for in the committee sessions. But perhaps the most significant change came in the form of a brand new Student Equity Council, an idea born from the protests and refined during long after-school planning meetings, and when it came time to elect its first president, the vote was unanimous. Zahara, whose poise, insight, and lived experience had become the guiding compass for so many, now stood at the helm of a council that would ensure no student ever felt as voiceless as she once had, and when she accepted, she did. So not with fanfare, but with a quiet determination, saying, "This is not about me. This is about every student who was told they weren't enough. We are rewriting that story together." When the new school year opened that fall, Jefferson High felt like a different place. Not perfect, not utopian, but undeniably changed, with murals painted across once blank halls, depicting scenes of unity and resilience, banners displaying quotes from Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, and an opening assembly that felt more like a cultural celebration than a procedural event. Zahara stood on stage in front of the entire student body, wearing a deep green blouse and natural curls that framed her face like a crown, holding the microphone with a calm confidence that made even the most distracted students look up from their phones, and when she began to speak, the gymnasium fell utterly silent, the kind of silence reserved for something sacred. "This school is changing," she began, her voice steady. "Not just for me, but for every student who's ever been told they don't belong, who's ever had their name mispronounced or their ideas dismissed, who's ever been graded not just on their work, but on how much they fit someone else's idea of who deserves to succeed." And her words hit like gentle thunder, not loud, but impossible to ignore, and by the time she concluded, "We are not guests in this space. We are the future it must be built for." The applause was so thunderous it echoed for nearly a minute, and as Zahara stepped back, she caught Liam's eye in the front row, his smile quiet, but full of something eternal, something like gratitude, something like pride, Something like brotherhood forged not by blood but by battle. He hadn't done it for recognition, and he never would. He had spoken out when silence became unbearable, when injustice stared him in the face and dared him to look away. And that moment, that decision had become a fulcrum on which both their lives pivoted. In the months that followed, the ripple effect only grew. Zahara began receiving invitations to speak at youth leadership conferences. Her inbox flooded with letters from other students, some in her own district, some across the country, sharing how her story had given them courage to confront bias in their own schools. And while the attention at times overwhelmed her, she grounded herself in purpose, remembering every moment she had once sat in the back of room 204, feeling invisible and unheard, vowing to ensure no one else ever felt that way again. She applied to several top-tier colleges, her application essays raw and unsparing, detailing not just her pain but her growth, how advocacy had become her armor, how community had become her compass, and how truth had become her weapon of choice. And when the acceptance letters began arriving in thick cream envelopes from schools like Harvard, Columbia, and Stanford, it felt less like victory and more like validation, like the universe nodding in agreement that her voice mattered, always had. Ultimately, she chose to attend Princeton, drawn by their social justice program and the opportunity to join a network of changemakers eager to disrupt outdated paradigms, and with a full-ride scholarship and a declaration to study both education, policy, and African American studies, she stepped into her future with the same dignity she had brought to every meeting, every protest, every speech. But Zahara never let go of her roots. She returned often to Jefferson High, mentoring younger students, helping the Equity Council flourish, and even teaching workshops on storytelling as activism, reminding others that their voices too could shift mountains. And Liam? While Zahara moved toward academia, Liam stayed local for a while, helping other schools start their own equity clubs, speaking at district meetings, and training student leaders in how to build coalitions and navigate school politics, work that earned him both enemies and admirers, but work he never regretted, because he had seen firsthand what happened when one voice stood up, and then another, until a chorus rose that could not be ignored. Eventually, he launched a non-profit organization called Speak Up Youth, partnering with educators and psychologists to bring peer-led equity training to middle and high schools across the state. And though his days were often long and his resources limited, he remained unwavering in his belief that young people were not just the future, they were the fiercest architects of the present. The classroom that once echoed with bias and indifference now echoed with questions and curiosity, with respect and inclusion, with laughter that felt freer and eyes that looked up instead of down. And though the work was far from finished, new challenges always surfaced, new tensions always arose. The foundation had been laid by two students who refused to believe that silence was safer than truth, and whose courage created a blueprint for what it meant to turn pain into purpose and resistance into reform. Even years later, when Zahara gave her graduation speech at Princeton and quoted her favorite Toni Morrison line, "Your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else," her voice cracked ever so slightly, not from nerves, but from memory, from the echo of a classroom that once tried to diminish her and failed, from the faces of students who had stood beside her in protest, from the warmth of a friendship that had anchored her through every storm. And as she looked out over the sea of caps and gowns, her mind wandered, just briefly, back to that moment in room 204 when a boy named Liam stood up, not to save her, but to stand with her, and in doing so, sparked a movement that would never die, because real change begins not with grand gestures, but with one brave voice saying, "Enough."